She lost her kittens, but fate brought her 4 wild bobcats who needed her heart. That night, the wind rose from the mountains, carrying thick snow that seemed to make the entire forest disappear into itself. Inside a small wooden cabin on the edge of Everland, Wyoming, Frank Mitchell sat silently by the fireplace, his old armchair creaking softly beneath him whenever he shifted. On the armrest, Janquil, the cream-colored cat, lay still, eyes half closed, wearing her usual quiet expression. Outside, the wind howled, pine trees collided, as if all of nature were groaning. The weather had begun to turn cold weeks earlier. Clusters of clouds drifted low over the mountain peaks, stretching across the dense pine canopy like the stale breaths of winter returning. Frank had stood on the porch of the wooden house, watching, his heart tightening as he saw Carolyn's shadow, his wife who had shared his pillow for so many years, leaning her head against the glass door, her face pale and frail. That memory lingered still. Even now, 3 years after her passing, some mornings, he could almost hear her footsteps on the wooden floor. The gentle way she used to hum while preparing breakfast. The sound of her laughter that once filled every corner of their home. Janquil rarely went out during this season. But one evening, she suddenly jumped down from the windowsill, growled softly, and scratched at the door. Frank was surprised. "What is it?" But she didn't respond, just kept clawing and howling, her body tense with an urgency he'd never seen before. Her claws scraped against the wood, a desperation that sent a chill through him. When he cracked the door open, Janquil darted outside as if something beyond the forest was more important than life itself. Within seconds, her paw prints had vanished into the thick white. Frank, panicked, threw on his coat, grabbed a flashlight, pulled up his hood, and ran into the woods. The snow fell harder now, stinging his face, the cold cutting through his layers. He called Jonquil's name, but the wind swallowed his voice. His boots sank deep into the drifts, each step a struggle. Branches whipped at his face, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead, the beam of his flashlight swallowed by the swirling white. Reaching a low ravine where the wind whipped with a sharper edge, his flashlight stopped, illuminating where Janquil stood. She didn't meow, just looked at them. Before she lay the body of a female bobcat, her belly torn open, blood staining the snow red and black. Nearby, 4 tiny bobcat cubs, their eyes barely open, huddled together, shivering, their cries no louder than breath. The metallic scent of blood hung in the frozen air, mixing with the sharp smell of pine and snow. Frank froze. The scene was brutal, stark against the white landscape. The mother bobcat must have fought something, perhaps a predator or the harsh elements themselves, and lost. Her body was already stiffening in the cold, her fur matted with ice and blood. Janquil approached the cubs, lowered her body. She didn't sniff the corpse, didn't hiss or scratch. She simply sat, calm, not aggressive, her presence a shield between the cubs and the cold. Frank stepped forward slowly, knelt down, and gently reached under the base of a tree. He tucked each tiny cub into his coat. They were limp, faintly warm, and wouldn't have lasted another hour in the cold. Their small bodies trembled against his chest as he held them close, his breath coming in short bursts from the exertion and the weight of what he just witnessed. One of the cubs mewed weakly, a sound so fragile it broke his heart. Back at the cabin, Frank placed the bobcat cubs on a blanket beside the fire. The flames cast flickering shadows across the room, and for a moment, everything felt suspended in time. Janquil stepped forward carefully, sniffed each one, and began to lick them, gently, patiently, one by one. Her tongue moved in deliberate strokes, cleaning away the traces of snow and blood, warming their tiny bodies with her touch. Then one of them began to search for a teat, and something extraordinary happened. Janquil allowed it to suckle, though she had no milk. Frank quickly prepared formula and began feeding the bobcat cubs himself, holding each one with trembling hands as they drank weakly from the small bottles he'd warmed. Their tiny mouths worked instinctively, desperate for nourishment, for warmth, for a mother's care. He stood in silence, realizing she was being a mother. Janquil had never had the chance to be a mother. The first time Frank ever saw her was when the medical van brought Caroline home from the hospital. In her arms was a cream-colored cat, strong and wary. "I named her Janquil," Carolyn whispered as Frank helped her down, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine idling. "January and tranquil. She'll stay with me until I go." And from then until a few weeks before she passed. Caroline cared for Janquil like her own child, with gentleness, with love. Frank simply watched Janquil, still as a mountain, as four wild creatures clung to her to survive. Now, Janquil was passing on the love Caroline had given her to a group of bobcat cubs, creatures not even of her own kind. The story of how Janquil came into their lives had begun in the coldest part of winter. 8 months before Caroline died, Frank had driven Caroline to the hospital every other day for treatments that left her weaker each time, her body frail and her voice softer. The doctors did what they could, but everyone knew the truth hung in the air like fog, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Caroline's hair had thinned, her skin grown translucent, and her once bright eyes had dulled with exhaustion and pain. She moved more slowly each day, her steps uncertain, her hand gripping Frank's arm with increasing desperation. One morning in early January, after another round of tests that left her nauseous and trembling, Carolyn asked to sit outside for a while. The hospital had a small courtyard with a few benches and bare trees, and despite the cold, she wanted to feel the air on her face. Frank wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and helped her to a bench near the entrance. They sat in silence, watching the clouds drift overhead, their breath visible in the freezing air. Carolyn's hands were pale and thin, the veins visible beneath the skin. That was when the cat appeared. It was thin, its cream-colored fur matted in places, its eyes sharp and wary. It moved along the edge of the courtyard like a shadow, keeping close to the walls, never coming near anyone. A nurse passing by noticed Caroline watching the cat and paused. "Oh, that one," she said with a tired smile. "Been hanging around for months. Won't let anyone near it. Some of the staff tried to catch it once, bring it to a shelter, but it scratched up a doctor pretty bad. We just leave it alone now." Carolyn watched the cat disappear around the corner of the building. "What happened to it?" she asked quietly, her voice hoarse from the treatments. The nurse shrugged, adjusting the folder in her arms. "Someone said it used to be pregnant. Got hit by a car in the parking lot. Lost the litter. It survived. But it's been like that ever since. Doesn't trust anyone. Doesn't seem to care about much. Just wanders around, looking for scraps." Frank felt Caroline's hand tighten around his. She didn't say anything, but he saw something shift in her expression. A softness mixed with recognition, as if she understood something the rest of them couldn't see. Her eyes followed this path where the cat had disappeared, and for the first time in weeks, he saw a spark of something in her face that wasn't pain. The next time they came to the hospital, Caroline asked Frank to help her to the same bench. The cat appeared again, moving cautiously along the far side of the courtyard. Caroline didn't call to it or try to approach. She just sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, and spoke in a voice barely louder than the wind. "I see you," she said softly. "I know you're hurting. I know you don't want to let anyone close. But I'm here. I'll be here." Frank watched her, unsure whether to interrupt or simply let her be. The cat didn't respond, didn't even glance in their direction. But it didn't leave either. It stayed at the edge of the courtyard, half hidden behind a bare shrub, its body tense but present, for weeks. Every visit followed the same pattern. Caroline would ask to sit outside, and the cat would appear. She spoke to it about small things, her childhood in Vermont, the garden she used to tend before she got sick, the way Frank used to surprise her with wildflowers he'd pick on his way home from work. She told the cat about the life she'd had, the life she was losing, and the quiet fear that lived inside her chest. Sometimes her voice would crack with emotion, and Frank would squeeze her hand gently, offering silent support. The cat listened from a distance, never approaching but never leaving. Frank sat beside her, holding her hand, saying nothing. He didn't need to. Caroline's words were for the cat, and somehow, in those moments, it felt like the cat was listening, day after day, week after week. The routine continued. Sometimes other patients would sit nearby, curious about the woman talking to a stray cat. Some smiled sympathetically, others looked away, uncomfortable with such raw vulnerability. One afternoon in late February, Carolyn's voice was weaker than usual. The treatments weren't working anymore. The doctors had told them that morning there was nothing more they could do, that it was time to think about going home, making her comfortable. Carolyn had nodded, her face pale but composed, and asked for one more visit to the courtyard. The sunlight was thin and cold, casting long shadows across the frozen ground. Her breathing was labored, and Frank had to support most of her weight as they walked. The cat was there, as always, sitting beneath a bare tree. Carolyn looked at it for a long time, her breath visible in the cold air. "Will you come home with me?" she asked quietly. "I won't be coming back here. There's no reason to anymore. But I'd like you to come with me, if you're willing. I don't want to leave you here alone." Frank didn't expect anything to happen. The cat had never come close, never shown any sign of trust or affection. But as Caroline spoke, it stood up slowly, took a few hesitant steps forward, and then, as if making a decision it had resisted for months, walked directly to her. It stopped in front of the bench, looked up at her with those sharp, unreadable eyes, and then gently lowered its head. Carolyn reached down with trembling hands and lifted the cat into her lap. It didn't resist, didn't make a sound. It simply settled against her, its body warm and still. Frank felt his throat tighten as he watched his wife cradle the cat like a child she'd been waiting for all her life. Tears streamed down Caroline's face, but she was smiling. On the drive home, Caroline held the cat in her arms, stroking its fur with slow, careful movements. "I'm going to call you Janquil," she whispered. "January, because it's when we met. And tranquil, because that's what you gave me. Peace, even in all of this. You gave me peace. You understood me even in silence." Janquil didn't meow, didn't purr. She just lay still, her eyes half closed, as if she had finally found a place she could rest for the next 3 weeks. Carolyn poured every ounce of strength she had left into caring for Janquil. She set up a soft bed near the window where the sunlight came through in the mornings. She spoke to the cat constantly, her voice gentle and patient, telling her stories, reading aloud from books, humming old songs Frank had almost forgotten. Janquil stayed close, always within sight, her wariness slowly giving way to something quieter, something that looked almost like trust. Carolyn would brush Janquil's fur gently, untangling the mats, cleaning her carefully. She prepared special meals, small portions of fish and chicken, watching with satisfaction as Janquil ate. Frank watched them together, his heart breaking and mending at the same time. He thought Caroline was too weak to care for anything, that bringing the cat home was just one more burden she didn't need. But he'd been wrong. Janquil wasn't a burden. She was a purpose, a reason for Caroline to keep going just a little longer. In the evenings, he would find them together by the window, Caroline's hand resting on Janquil's back, both of them watching the sunset in comfortable silence. One evening, as Frank brought Caroline her medication, he found her lying in bed with Janquil curled up beside her. Caroline's hand rested on the cat's back, her fingers moving slowly through the cream-colored fur. "She's like me," Caroline said softly, her eyes on the ceiling. "She lost something she can never get back. But she's still here. She's still trying. She knows what it means to grieve." Frank sat down on the edge of the bed and took his wife's other hand. "You gave her a reason to try," he said quietly. Carolyn turned her head to look at him, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Maybe she gave me one too. Maybe we saved each other." 3 weeks after Janquil came home, on a quiet morning in early March, Caroline passed away. Frank had been sitting beside her, holding her hand, when her breathing slowed and then stopped. The house fell into a silence so complete it felt like the world itself had stopped turning. The clock on the mantel ticked on, indifferent, marking time that no longer mattered. Outside, birds continued to sing. Life went on, oblivious to the profound loss that had just occurred within these walls. Janquil had been lying at the foot of the bed when Caroline's hand went still. The cat lifted her head, stared at Frank for a long moment, and then moved slowly up the bed to rest beside Caroline's body. She didn't meow, didn't cry. She just lay there, her body pressed close, as if trying to keep Caroline warm. Frank couldn't move. He sat there for hours, his hand still holding his wife's, his mind unable to process what had just happened. Janquil didn't leave. She stayed exactly where she was, her eyes open, her breathing shallow. When the hospice nurse arrived to officially pronounce Caroline's death, she found them like that, man and cat keeping vigil together. The funeral was small, a few neighbors, Caroline's cousin from out of state, Dr. Samuel Brooks, the retired veterinarian who'd known them for years. People came to the house afterward, bringing food and quiet condolences. But Frank barely heard them. He moved through the rooms like a ghost, nodding when spoken to, accepting embraces he couldn't feel. Words of comfort washed over him without meaning. Janquil had retreated to Caroline's chair by the window, the one she'd sat in every morning to watch the sunrise. The cat hadn't eaten since Caroline died. She hadn't moved except to shift position slightly. Always staying in that chair, her eyes fixed on nothing, her body seemed smaller somehow, diminished by grief. Frank tried to coax her to eat, setting out food and water, speaking to her gently. But Janquil ignored him completely. On the third day, Frank began to worry she would die too. That grief would take her the same way it was slowly taking him. He sat beside the chair, talking to Janquil in the same gentle voice Caroline had used. "Please," he whispered, "please don't leave me too that evening." After the last visitor had left and the house had settled into its new, unbearable quiet, Frank sat in his armchair by the fireplace, his head in his hands. He didn't cry, he couldn't. The grief was too heavy, too vast, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. His entire body ached with the effort of simply breathing. He heard a soft sound, the quiet pat of paws on the wooden floor. He looked up and saw Janquil walking toward him, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him, not with the wary, distant expression she'd worn for months, but with something else, something that felt like recognition, like understanding. Frank stared at her, his throat tight. "I thought you loved no one," he said quietly. "But then I saw you stay awake for 3 nights, not eating, not making a sound, not leaving the chair where my wife used to sit. That's when I understood. You were hurting just like me. You lost her too." Janquil took another step forward, lifted her head, and looked at him for a very long time. For the first time, Frank felt like he truly saw her, not as a stray cat Caroline had taken in, but as someone who understood loss in a way no one else could. Two souls who had lost the same woman, finding each other in the quiet. He reached out his hand slowly, uncertain. Janquil hesitated, then walked closer and pressed her head gently against his palm. Frank's chest heaved, and the tears he'd been holding back finally came. He wept quietly, his hand resting on Janquil's head, and the cat stayed with him, steady and still, as if she knew he needed her to be there. In that moment, they became more than man and cat. They became survivors, witnesses to each other's pain. From that night on, they lived together in a kind of shared silence. Frank went through the motions of daily life, feeding himself and Janquil, tending to the cabin, walking through the woods when the weight of the house became too much. Janquil followed him sometimes, keeping a few paces behind, never demanding attention, but always present. They ate meals in the same room, each lost in their own thoughts. They sat by the fire on cold evenings, the only sound the crackling of wood and the occasional sigh. Weeks turned into months. Winter deepened, the snow piling higher, the nights growing longer. Frank and Janquil existed side by side, two beings who had lost the same person, who carried the same grief, who understood each other in a way that needed no words. Frank would sometimes find himself talking to Janquil the way Caroline had, telling her about his day, sharing memories of Caroline, speaking his loneliness into the quiet air. And then, on that night when the wind rose from the mountains and the snow fell thick and heavy, Janquil heard something Frank couldn't. She scratched at the door, desperate and insistent, and led him into the forest to find 4 orphaned bobcat cubs whose mother had died in the cold. Weeks later, the town buzzed with rumors. A house cat was raising bobcat cubs. Dr. Samuel Brooks, the retired veterinarian, came to see for himself. When he walked in and saw Janquil lying among the cubs, he stood in silence for a long time. The scene before him defied everything he knew about animal behavior. "Frank, I've never seen anything like this," he said quietly, shaking his head in wonder. Frank only nodded. "Me neither." Dr. Brooks examined each cub, his experienced hands gentle and thorough. "They're going to live. If you'd found them an hour later that night, they wouldn't have made it." Then he looked at Janquil and said softly, "The mothering instinct runs deep, deeper than we understand." Frank walked him to the door, and that night, for the first time, he told Brooks the full story of Janquil, how she'd been astray at the hospital, how she'd lost her own litter in an accident, how Caroline had spoken to her for months before bringing her home, how she'd stayed by Caroline's side until the very end. Caroline chose her. "Not me," Frank said, his eyes on the fire. "That cat used to wander the hospital where my wife was receiving treatment. She didn't belong to anyone. Let no one touch her. Once, someone saw her scratch a doctor who tried to pick her up. They called her grumpy, said she loved no one. People whispered that Janquil had once been pregnant but miscarried after an accident near the parking lot, and she had been silent ever since. But every morning, Caroline would sit by the window and call her with a voice soft as the wind. She told her stories about her youth, about me, about hiking trips and gardening. The cat never reacted, but she also never left." Brooks listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. He poured himself another cup of coffee and settled deeper into his chair, understanding that this was a story that needed to be told. Then one day, Carolyn packed to go home. Frank continued. She stroked the cat and said, "Will you come home with me?" Janquil didn't meow, didn't run. She simply lowered her head into Caroline's hand, like she'd been waiting for permission to belong to someone again. Frank paused, his voice breaking slightly. Caroline died 3 weeks later. Janquil never left the chair where she had lain. She didn't eat for 3 days. I thought she might die too. But she didn't. She simply lived in silence. As I did, we grieved together without words. Brooks said nothing for a moment, then quietly asked, "And now, with the cubs, she's a mother again." Frank looked toward the blanket, where Janquil was curled up. The cubs sprawled asleep, one nestled into her neck. Maybe, for the first time in all these years, she's not alone. Maybe she's found her purpose again. Since that day, the old cabin, once home to only an old man and a cat, suddenly became noisy, alive. Frank laid out more blankets, moved his armchair closer to the fire, and covered the floor with towels. Janquil never left the cubs. She stayed close, her eyes always open, her body curled to shield them from the cold. The cubs snuggled together. Faint breaths in the night, quiet whimpers when the chill returned. Their small cries filled the house with a kind of life that had been missing for so long. Dr. Brooks visited now and then, bringing replacement milk, clean cloths, and mild antiseptics for cleaning. He showed Frank how to feed them properly, how to check their temperatures, how to watch for signs of illness or distress. Frank followed his instructions carefully, treating each cub with the same gentle patience Carolyn had once shown to Janquil. He learned to recognize their individual cries, to know which sound meant hunger and which meant discomfort. Time passed. The snow slowly melted, the days grew longer, and warm sunlight streamed through the windows. The 4 bobcat cubs grew quickly. Each week, Frank marked their height with a pencil on a wooden beam leaning against the wall. Every mark was a tiny witness of time, of lives saved. The house became more cramped, wooden floors smudged with scattered paw prints, toys everywhere, cloth scraps, bits of yarn, cardboard boxes. But Frank didn't mind. He smiled gently as he watched them jump, tussle over a piece of yarn, and chase each other around the bed. He named them carefully, thoughtfully, the way Caroline would have wanted. Scout, the eldest and boldest, always the first to explore a new corner of the cabin. Fern, observant and cautious, who watched everything before making a move. Daisy, the frailest, who struggled with fevers and needed extra care. And Ash, the quiet youngest, who never ate unless Janquil first touched his bowl with her nose. Janquil, once so reserved, now occasionally opened her eyes to watch the little ones play. When they stumbled, clumsy and uncertain, she didn't intervene. She just observed in silence. Sometimes, one would miss a jump and fall flat onto the floor. Janquil would merely lift her head, glance over, then lean in to lick the cub's nose, as if to awaken it, to check if it was okay. When the first bloom opened in the garden Frank had planted, a delicate white petal trembling in the breeze, he understood it wasn't just the cubs who were growing up. He and Janquil were changing too. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a home again, every morning. Frank still prepared milk for the cubs, setting out each small bowl on the floor. But he always noticed one thing. Ash, the quiet youngest, never ate unless Janquil first touched the bowl with her nose. Even though his teeth had come in, his fur grown full, Ash still waited for his mother to approve the food, as if it were a sacred ritual. Only when Janquil gently licked the rim of the bowl did Ash begin to eat. Frank never interfered. He just smiled, leaned back in his wooden chair, and listened to the wordless repetition of deeply emotional habits. Daisy, the frailest of the litter, once ran a slight fever that night. Frank woke with a start at a soft rustling sound. He stepped into the living room and saw Janquil curled around Daisy's tiny body. She didn't purr, didn't warm with sound. She used her body to hold the heat, lying close, just like she had done with Caroline in her final nights. Frank stood there for a time, his hand pressed to his chest. He realized Janquil didn't mother out of instinct. She learned it through love. Everything Caroline had taught her, she was now teaching them. Fern, lively and observant, had likely learned the most from her mother. One evening, Janquil lay tired, not eating, unmoving from her chair. Fern approached. Not to play, she gently stepped close and began to lick Janquil's face. Slow, deliberate strokes. It wasn't play, it was care. Frank was stunned. He remembered the times Janquil had licked Fern when she was sick. Now, the roles had reversed. That quiet cycle of life stung his eyes. It was the same kindness Caroline had shown Janquil, now coming full circle. One evening, Dr. Brooks visited, examining each cub now covered in thick fur, ears alert, claws sharp. They're growing fast, he said. Teeth are coming in. If they don't have space, they won't last much longer in the cabin. The way he looked at Janquil, not just at a cat, but at a mother, made Frank fall silent. He knew the time had come. They had to return to the forest, to where they truly belonged. Frank struggled with the thought for days. He'd grown attached to the cubs, to the noise and life they'd brought into his home. But more than that, he worried about Janquil. She'd lost Caroline. She'd lost her own litter years ago. Now she was about to lose these cubs too. How much loss could one small creature endure? How many goodbyes could a heart survive? But Janquil seemed to understand before he did. She began spending more time near the back door, sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the forest with a stillness that felt different from her usual quiet. She wasn't restless, she was preparing. Sometimes she would call softly to the cubs, leading them outside, teaching them to observe the woods, to listen to the sounds of wildlife, to recognize danger. Spring lasted longer than usual. The snow melted slowly, water seeped into the earth, green shoots pushed up through the dried leaves from last season. Frank watched the backyard, now a playground for the bobcat cubs to run, play, and chase each other around wooden crates and the sagebush. They were growing wild again, their instincts awakening, their bodies strong and capable. The following month, Scout, the eldest, became increasingly independent. One morning, he nudged open the back door with a shoulder. Stepping onto the wooden porch, Janquil followed. But instead of stopping him, she placed a dry leaf on the doorstep, then sat and watched. Scout turned his head, touched his nose to hers for a long moment, then disappeared into the forest. His spotted coat blended into the dappled shadows until he vanished completely. Frank watched from the window, his chest tight. He didn't understand the gesture, but something about it felt intentional, deliberate, like a ritual Janquil had created for herself. A way of marking each departure, of honoring each goodbye. 2 weeks later, Fern left. Janquil did the same. A leaf, a look, a nose touch, and silence. The ritual repeated, solemn and beautiful. Daisy followed a week after that. Another leaf, another goodbye, each time. Janquil sat on the porch for hours afterward, watching the tree line, her body still, but her eyes alert. When Ash, the last, vanished into the woods on a warm morning in early summer, Frank stepped onto the porch and saw 4 dry leaves neatly arranged by the door. Janquil no longer added more. She just sat there for a long time, her body still, her eyes fixed on the tree line. The leaves were different colors, different shapes, as if she had chosen each one carefully to represent each cub. Frank knelt beside her, his hand resting on her back. He cried, not from loss, but from understanding. True love always comes with the permission to let the ones you cherish go. Carolyn had understood that. Now Janquil did too, and finally, so did he. Summer arrived. Frank watered his garden in the early mornings, tending to the rows of sage and wildflowers he'd planted in Caroline's memory. One day, as he quietly adjusted the plants, Janquil ran out and froze. Frank looked up, his hand still holding the watering can. At the edge of the woods, all 4 bobcats, now strong and grown, appeared one by one. They lay still for a moment, silent. Then each stepped forward. Scout approached first, his body powerful now, moving with the confidence of a born leader. He touched his nose to Janquil's firmly, briefly, the way he had always done everything, direct and sure. Then Fern, graceful as always, her touch gentle and deliberate, holding the contact just long enough to say, I remember what you taught me. Daisy came next, the one who had been sick, who had been warmed by Janquil's body through that feverish night. She pressed her whole face against Janquil's, lingering, as if to say, I'm strong now because of you. And finally Ash, the quiet one, the last to leave. He stood before Janquil for a long moment, their eyes meeting, before slowly, reverently, touching his nose to hers, the same ritual he had performed every morning before eating, seeking her approval one final time. That night, the house was quiet, truly quiet, for the first time in years. Janquil didn't sleep in her usual spot. Frank searched and stopped before Caroline's room. He gently opened the door and saw Janquil lying exactly where Carolyn once did, for the first time in 3 years. She wasn't curled, wasn't alert. She slept peacefully, breath steady, eyes closed. Her body was relaxed in a way Frank hadn't seen since before Caroline died. Frank sat down on the edge of the bed, watching her for a long time. He knew she had completed her journey. She had been a daughter to Caroline. She had become a mother to the cubs. She had learned to love, to nurture, and finally, to let go. Each role had healed something in her, had filled some of the emptiness left by loss. Every year, on the exact day Caroline died, Janquil would go to the forest's edge on her own. She would stand there for a longer time, facing toward the town, where the old hospital was. Frank used to watch from a distance. He didn't call her, didn't follow. He simply let her visit the grave in her own way, let her remember in silence. But this year, Frank followed, without calling. They stood there, an old man and a quiet cat, eyes turned toward the old hospital where Caroline once stayed. No words, no music, only the rustle of the wind and a deep sense of closure. They had both survived their grief. They had both found ways to keep living, to keep loving. That late afternoon, Frank lay back in his armchair, eyes closed. Janquil jumped up, settled on the armrest. No rubbing, no purring, just lay still, like the night Caroline died. Frank placed a hand on her back and gently stroked. He said nothing, and Janquil needed nothing. She was no longer the feral cat wandering the hospital halls. She had lost a mother. Caroline, she had once lost her own litter in that miscarriage, but she had also been a daughter, quietly loved, then became a mother by passing that same love on. And finally, she had let her children go, without clinging, without blame. The house returned to silence, but it was no longer a cold stillness. It was a quiet that healed. An old man, a cat, no words needed, just presence. Together. No one had to go on alone. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.